Welcome back to another episode of the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and today we have a special interview episode, a listener Q&A episode with Bishop Barron, who's with us in studio. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Brandon, it's always a joy to be with you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. My wife and I just got back home from a cross-country trip from Orlando to Santa Barbara. We were there in your neck of the woods to celebrate the wedding of a good pair of friends of ours, John and Emily Carney. They got married at the mission there in Santa Barbara, and you were there. Of course, you were celebrating the nuptial mass, and you gave a homily. Talk a little bit about this event, and I want to note especially in your homily, you looked at the significance of marriage and talked about how it was unique among the other sacraments. Maybe you can tell us a little about that.
Yeah, it was a joy, of course, to preside at that wedding. I've known John for a long time, and he's worked at Word on Fire for about 5 years. And then Emily, his new wife, is a lovely gal. So it was a wonderful experience. And I made that point that it's kind of a peculiarity of Catholic sacramental theology that marriage is not so much a sacrament that we receive, but rather a sacrament that these two people become. So sacrament is a sacred sign, right, of God's presence. And what the two young people do in front of the priest is they exchange their vows. They pledge their love to each other. And the priest witnesses that. And he's witnessing the fact that they are becoming thereby a sacrament of God's love in the world. So as Paul, of course, said that marriage is a kind of mysterion. He said it's a mystery. And that's rendered in Latin as sacramentum. It's a sacred sign of God's love in the world. And that's why people get married in church. As I said, it's not just because they fell in love. You know, any secular romantic could look at the two of them and say, oh, those two kids are in love. Isn't that great? Well, it is great, but it's no reason to get married in church. You get married in church when you say, we are willing together to be a sacrament for the world. So it's something very powerful and rich. And I think maybe in the last many decades, we've kind of forgotten that profound theology of marriage.
Well, today, as I mentioned, we're doing a special listener Q&A episode. We do these every few months, and we love them because it gives us a chance to hear from all of our listeners and to answer the specific questions you're wondering about. If you have a question, please visit askbishopbarron.com and record the question, and maybe we'll choose your question in a future episode. Today we have about 7 or 8 questions lined up, and we're going to try to go through them rapid fire. We'll see how many we get through. But first, we're going to start with a question from Cameron. She lives in St. Louis, and she's wondering why Jesus needed to be baptized. So here's Cameron's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Cameron in St. Louis, and I had a question about Christ's baptism. I'm reading Pope Benedict's Jesus of Nazareth from the baptism to the transfiguration, and I had just finished his chapter on the baptism, and I'm trying to wrap my head around it a little bit more. Did he get baptized just to fulfill Old Testament prophecy, or what was the true necessity of the nature of the baptism? I'm trying to understand that a little bit more deeply, so any help you could offer would be great. Thanks. God bless.
Good. Thanks for that. Good question. First, there's a technical point. Whenever the word necessary is used in regard to Jesus, something in me tightens a little bit, and it's because I'm a Thomist. Thomas Aquinas was uneasy with what he took to be a necessitarianism within the theological argumentation of some of his heritage. Someone like Anselm comes to mind, who would, in a strictly logical way, I can show you it was necessary that, God became man, that he died on a cross, etc. Where Thomas distinguished between an argument ex necessitate and an argument ex convenientia. That's Latin for an argument from necessity and an argument from fittingness, say convenientia. So Thomas says, for example, could God have saved us apart from the incarnation? And the answer is yes, he could have. But there was no more fitting way for him to do it than by becoming one of us. So that's an example. So here I'd apply the same principle. Was it necessary for Jesus to be baptized? No, not strictly speaking. It wasn't necessary for Jesus to be born. I mean, we could be saved in some other way. Rather, I'd use the language of fittingness. See, and now the Father's perspective opens up. Was it fitting that he be baptized? And the answer here is yes, because he identifies so fully with sinners. He's not a sinner himself. If he were, he'd need to be saved. But as Savior, he enters into the muddy waters of the Jordan side by side with sinners and submits to a baptism of repentance. It was a sign of his humility and identity with those he had come to save. In that sense, it was altogether fitting that he be baptized. And that's why in Matthew's version, he says to John, we must do this to fulfill all righteousness, right? There's that word again, dikaiosune, righteousness. This is appropriate and fitting for the rectification of the world, that I identify as Messiah with sinners. That's how I would maybe break that one down.
Next up, we have a question from Elizabeth, who is a wonderful young girl in Mexico. So here's Elizabeth's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Elizabeth Navarro. I'm from Mexico, and I'm 8 years old. My question is why Jesus is named Jesus instead of Emmanuel, like the prophet said. Why he has different names? Thank you, and greetings from Mexico.
Thank you for those greetings. What a great question. And what good English you have. Good. It's the Isaiah prediction, of course, the prophecy that this child will be born and will be called Emmanuel. And of course, Emmanuel is Hebrew for God with us. El is God, Emanu, with us, Emmanuel. You might say this, that Emmanuel is naming who Jesus is. Now, Yeshua, we get Jesus from that eventually. Yeshua is the Hebrew for Yahweh saves. The AH ending at the end is, or Yah ending is Yahweh, Yeshua. Yahweh saves. They're both naming something essential about Jesus. How does Yahweh save us? Well, by becoming Emmanuel, by becoming God with us. So one, you might say, names what he does. The other one names who he is. Yeshua is the name that he actually carries through life, but both are important designations of who he is and what he does.
Next up is another question regarding names. It comes from Jacob, who lives in Baton Rouge. So here's Jacob's question.
Hey, Bishop Barron, this is Jacob from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I am wondering about the different names for God in the Old Testament. My Bible gives a different English translation for El, Elohim, Eloah, the Tetragrammaton, Adonai, and so on and so on. What truth can be gained from this? How should I read this in the proper context? Is there anything I'm missing, or can I just use the name God? Thanks.
That's a cool and very searching question. Thank you for that. Let me start with an image from my hero, Thomas Aquinas, who said that God in himself is a bit like pure light. Now think of our consciousness as something like a prism. And when white light passes through a prism, it breaks into a variety of colors, right? What we're seeing is light, but now we're seeing it according to different modalities. In some ways, when God's light breaks through the prism of this world and our finite consciousness, it breaks into a variety of colors. So, for example, we talk about all of God's different attributes, right? God is wise, God is powerful, God is just, God is merciful, etc. But they're all naming the same thing because God is in himself simple. In him, essence and existence coincide. That means that all the attributes are naming God, though they break through the prism of our consciousness as a variety of different aspects. Does that make sense? So apply it now to your question. There are a lot of different names of God in the Old Testament because they're each naming a different dimension of the fullness of God. They're a different aspect of God's perfection. I think, too, from Aquinas, why is the world as variegated as it is? Think how wildly variegated and diverse the world is, of animals and species and insects and stars and planets and sand on the shore. There's this incredible variety. Well, because Thomas says God's perfection can't be exhausted by any one creature, by any 10 creatures, by any gazillion million creatures. They all speak of some aspect of God's perfection, right? So now, again, back to your question. Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton. I mean, Yahweh is just our way of putting it. It's literally meant to be unpronounceable, grounded in the self-revelation to Moses, Eyeh Asher Eyeh, right? I am who I am, or whatever that really means. The point is, God is unspeakable. God is beyond whatever we can imagine, beyond all of our concepts. If I can speak it, then I can control it to some degree, right? Well, you can't control God, and hence the Tetragrammaton, the unpronounceable name. What's used as a substitute for that? Typically, as you say correctly, Adonai, right? Which means the Lord. The Lord. And we see it now throughout the Bible. It's a way of speaking of God when I can't use the Tetragrammaton. But Lord has a whole range of references. Lord has a political sense, doesn't it? He's the one that I obey. He's the powerful one that I should obey. But as Paul Tillich said, Lord also has a kind of aesthetic sense. The lordliness of God is something awful, awesome, right? The Germans talk about the Erhabenheit Gottes, the sublimity of God, right? And that's named by this term Adonai, or Lord. You mentioned El and Elohim, right? Well, El is a kind of primordial name for God. Elohim is the plural. And what's going on there? Well, there is that strange thing in the Bible where God is both singular and plural. Well, now, we Christians in the fullness of revelation know what that's perhaps driving at, this play of diversity within the unity of God. Now, my point is, all these different names are indicating something, but they're all under the aegis of the Tetragrammaton, because I can't speak clearly of God. That's why St. Augustine said, si comprehendis non est Deus, right? If you understand, that's not God. So the minute you think you've got it, you don't have it. That's why the Aquinas will say that I know that God is, but in this life, I don't know what God is. I gesture at it through a range of highly analogical descriptions. And I think the beginning of that is in the Bible itself.
Well, continuing down the path of probing theological questions, we have another one from Hope, who lives in your Archdiocese of Los Angeles. She's wondering about Jesus and his incapacity or unwillingness to sin. Here's Hope's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name's Hope, and I'm from Los Angeles. My question was about Jesus being our perfect model for not sinning. Did he not sin in his life due to divine grace or human willpower alone? Thanks.
Wow, these are the these are the major league of questions we're getting today. Because you want to visit that question, go to the 16th century, and you'll see some of the subtlest minds ever in the Catholic tradition wrestling with that problem. How can I start with that? First of all, there's no competition or conflict between the divine grace and human freedom. In fact, the closer God gets, the freer I become. See, it's not as though we're competing for the same space. You know, so if you're coming to dominate me, that means that my will's got to cede to yours, right? And that's true within the finite realm. But God is not one being among many. When God comes close, who's the very ground of my own being, I become, in fact, freer. See, freedom is not hovering above the yes and the no. Rather, authentic freedom is a disciplining of desire so as to make the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. Think of the way you learn how to play a piano or swing a golf club or speak a language freely, right? The more you internalize the law in those areas, the freer you become. Now, so with God. The closer God's grace gets to me, the more I imbibe it, the freer I become to be the person that actually I deep down want to be. Sin is an alienation from the divine grace, which makes me unfree. Now, all that's an elaborate background for Jesus, who's the prime example here. We talk about the two natures coming together in Jesus, right? Divine and human. Does he have a divine will? Answer, yes. Does he have a human will? Answer, yes. Are they in conflict? No, because they are so tight in their correlation that the human will is a perfect partner of the divine will. So is Jesus sinless because of his human freedom or his divine grace? Yes, is the answer. It's both at the same time, and one because of the other. They're not in conflict with each other. And now that's true of all the great saints, is the saints to varying degrees have so imbibed the divine grace that they found a deeper freedom. As a sinner, I'm unfree. I'm resisting the divine grace, which is making me unfree. The more I become, as Paul said, the doulos Christou Jesu, the more I become the slave of Christ Jesus, then the freer I become. It's for freedom Christ has set me free, says the same Paul, right? So look to Jesus and say, is it divine grace or human freedom? Answer, yes. It's both of them, and one because of the other.
Okay, let's turn to a little lighter question from our jolly friend G.K. Chesterton. This question comes from Frank, who lives in Brooklyn and is wondering about one of Chesterton's famous quotes.
Good evening, Bishop Barron. My name is Frank, calling in from Brooklyn, New York. Thanks to you, I've become a huge fan of G.K. Chesterton. The quote that's been attributed to him in Catholicism, the pint, the pipe, and the cross can all fit together. What does this quote mean? Thank you, and may God continue to bless your ministry.
Hey, thank you for that, and I'm delighted. If I've led you anywhere near G.K. Chesterton, I feel my work is done here. I first read him when I was a kid. I was about 19, and I've loved him ever since too. So I'm delighted. It's typical Chesterton, isn't it? One thing that he always hated was Puritanism. He didn't like the sort of dualistic Manichaean approach to spirituality, whereby high spiritual things are good, but lowly material things are bad. Something he had in common there with, I think, Lewis and Tolkien and others in that circle was a keen sense of how good the world of matter is, how good the world of sensual pleasure is. God saw all these things and found them good. What's problematic is always sin, not matter, right? It's not the body that's the problem, it's sin. The sin will distort the body and distort matter and misuse it, but matter in itself is not the problem. Neither is pleasure. Now, pleasure, if it becomes your God, is a problem. You make an idolatry of pleasure. But in itself, a good pipe. Now, I gave up pipe smoking. I used to smoke a pipe years ago. I loved every minute of it, I must say. When I was a younger man, I smoked a pipe. After a good meal, I loved it. In heaven, I'll pick it up again. But I just thought it's unhealthy, so I gave it up. But I loved it. I'm not much of a drinker myself, but, I appreciate people that, within moderation, enjoy, a good beer or a glass of wine or something. And that's good. That's good. That's a healthy, integrated spirituality that sees the spiritual not in competition with the material, sees the world not through Manichaean dualistic lenses, but sees all of it as part of a great comedy, the great comedy of salvation. And I think Chesterton embodied that. He taught it, but he also embodied it.
When you think of Chesterton and wine, you naturally think of his good friend Hilaire Belloc, who wrote that quatrain that wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there's always laughter and good red wine.
That's right. His great friend. And at least I've always found it so. Benedicti camus Domino is as you say, the rest of that. And that's a good Catholic instinct. And we don't eschew those things. We eschew the sin that distorts them.
Well, next up, we have a question from Kathy from Kansas, who asks a pointed question about the devil. So here's Kathy's question.
My name is Kathy from Overland Park, Kansas. My question is, from the beginning, why did God allow the devil to exist?
Good. I would say this, that the evil of the devil is part of a more general problem, which is a problem of freedom. So God made spiritual creatures, we call them angels, okay? Just as he made human beings. Human beings fell through an abuse of their freedom. So we say in a more primordial way, some of the angels fell as an abuse of their freedom. So what's the sin of the devil? We're talking about the Satan sin. It's arrogating to himself the prerogatives of God. Same, by the way, is human sin. It takes that same basic form. It's always arrogating to yourself what belongs to God alone. God allows this. Why? For the greater good of real spiritual freedom. Because see, without spiritual freedom, we can't participate in the divine life. Does that make sense? I mean, God could make a universe of animals and plants as he has, or of mere puppets. But God wanted people who would really share his life. And that means a life of moral freedom and of real spiritual responsibility. Well, if you want that, as God clearly did, you must allow for the possibility of that freedom being abused. So God, we would say, rather permits the corruption that happened with the devil so as to allow for the greater good of real spiritual freedom in his creation. Is God happy with the devil's fall? No. God is chagrined by it. Now, let me make one more point about the devil, because I always find there's certain confusion. I think it's born of our Gnostic revival of dualism because of Star Wars and all that New Age stuff. The devil is not God's rival. The devil is not God's counterpart. That there's God who represents good, and then there's this equal power of the devil. Absolutely not. The devil is a creature, which means he stands ontologically at an infinite remove from God. He's a creature of God. Whatever existence he has is allowed by God. Furthermore, is the devil pure evil? No, pure evil is like saying a square circle. You can't have pure evil, because evil is always a privatio boni, as they say. It's the privation of the good. Therefore, it's parasitic, right? Like a cavity in a tooth. You can't have a cavity without a tooth. You can't have a heart attack without a heart. So the devil is a corrupt spiritual creature, not God's rival. I mean, come on. I mean, like that, God could annihilate the devil. Not God's counterpart in a dualistic battle. But the devil is a corrupt spiritual agent who's wreaked havoc. Now, we can have a whole show on that sometime if you want, and continues to wreak havoc in the world. But don't think of the devil as God's rival.
Let's turn now to Kyle, who's a new husband and father living in Philadelphia, and he's looking for a few recommendations. So here's Kyle's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Kyle from Philadelphia. I'm a new husband and a soon-to-be new father, and I was wondering, besides St. Joseph, who do you recommend as far as saints to study who are both husbands and fathers? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. Somebody recommend one of my great heroes, St. Thomas More, layman, statesman, a man who was twice married. His first wife died, and loved his children very dearly. Read that beautiful letter he writes to his daughter, Margaret. He calls her Meg in the letter. Very touching. He's in prison at the time. Study Thomas More, layman, father. Study one of our newest saints, St. Louis Martin, who's the father of the Little Flower. Louis and his wife Zélie, who also canonized. And the two of them, fascinating relationship at a lot of different levels. But read his story. And there's someone who exercised an extraordinary fatherly care over 5 of his daughters, who became sisters, one of whom became one of the greatest saints in the church. So read him. But something else, and Brandon, maybe you say more about this, but just as John Paul II was deeply influenced in his own spirituality by lay people, by lay people who were great fathers, I think it works the other way too. Maybe Brandon, say a word about that.
Yeah, I had the same thought that, I, as a father and husband, look to somebody like John Paul II for great inspiration, because heroic virtue can play across the divide for lay people and for clergy. And so someone like John Paul II, I've learned a lot about what it means to be a spiritual father and a leader and somebody who's deeply committed to the faith. Hey, we got one final question here, Bishop. This one comes from Erin. She lives in Las Vegas, and she's wondering, if people are known by their fruit, why does it sometimes seem that non-Christians bear better fruit than their Christian counterparts? Here's Erin's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Erin in Las Vegas. Jesus says, "You will know them by their fruit." My question is why some people who don't believe in God at all seem to be good, loving, selfless people, while some people who appear to be practicing their faith seem mean and angry. Is there a certain disposition towards goodness that some people are just born with, the way that some people are naturally thin, even though they don't work out, while others work very hard and are still overweight? Thank you so much for your insight. Yeah,
actually, I like that analogy. It's pretty cool. I think there's something right about that. It doesn't seem entirely fair, does it? If you're working all day and you're still gaining weight, and some guy that just eats whatever he wants, never works out, and he's skinny. There's something right about that, and the instinct is a good one spiritually to look for the fruits. Think of Galatians chapter 5, the fruits of the Holy Spirit. I often point people to that part of the Bible. If you're discerning a vocation, you're trying to figure out what does God want, that's a good place to look, is what are the fruits that it bears. So when I walk this path, do I become more patient, more loving, more kind, more just, and so on? And when I walk some other path, do I become more difficult, more obnoxious, less trustful, more impatient? Those are good signs. That's a good instinct. And are there people with kind of a natural goodness? I think, yeah. Friedrich Schleiermacher, not someone I admire that much as a theologian, but he said something that I think is right, that some people are kind of natural artistic geniuses. He thought there were some people that were natural religious geniuses. They just kind of had naturally a mystical sense of religious things. And other people, it's the opposite. They just seem to have a hard time with religion. It just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. They got to work harder. Part of that's the mystery of God's providence, that God allows for such a variety in his creation. But I like your instinct of looking for the fruits, because, the thing about the spiritual life, a good place to close maybe today, is after everything is said and done, what the spiritual life comes down to? Love. Are you growing in love? Three things that last: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these, Paul says, is love, because love is what God is, right? So all of your prayer, all of the sacraments, all your everything, liturgy, everything else has to do with inculcating in you a deeper love. So that's what it's finally all about. I think if you focus on that, you give yourself, as Perez said, the little way, do the little things with great love, you're ipso facto growing in the spiritual order.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. We hope you enjoyed these listener Q&A exchanges. Again, if you had a question, we'd love to hear it. Just visit askbishopbarron.com and record your question, and maybe you'll be featured the next time we do one of these roundups. One more announcement, Lent is right around the corner. This year it falls on Wednesday, March 1st. So February is a short month, and then bam, Lent begins. So to prepare for Lent, be sure to visit lentreflections.com and sign up. When you do, Bishop Barron will send you a short reflection on the gospel reading every day throughout Lent. It's a great way to deepen your Lent. You'll also receive some great graphics and inspiring quotes. So go visit lentreflections.com right now, and then when Ash Wednesday rolls around, you'll be well prepared. Thanks so much for listening to the Word on Fire show, and we'll see you next week.